Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome back to the Sleepy Story. Tonight, before we drift into dreams, we will wander through a small collection of the world's most beloved fairy tale stories that have been whispered beside firesides and bedtime lamps for generations. You may hear the gentle tale of Snow White, the young princess whose beauty stirred envy in a wicked queen, and who found refuge in a quiet cottage deep within the forest. Or perhaps the story of Little Red Riding Hood, walking bravely along a woodland path, carrying cake and wine to her grandmother, unaware of the cunning wolf waiting among the trees. We may also visit the lonely tower, where Rapunzel, with hair like spun gold, gazed out across the forest while singing softly to the wind. Or journey with Hansel and Gretel, two brave children lost in the deep woods, who discover a mysterious house made of bread and sugar. And somewhere in a quiet kingdom, wrapped in time itself, Sleeping Beauty rests beneath a spell, waiting for the moment when 100 years of silence finally awaken. These old stories move slowly like footsteps through a quiet forest, filled with moonlight, gentle magic, and the calm rhythm of timeless dreams. So rest comfortably now, breathe slowly, and let the soft world of fairy tales carry you peacefully into sleep. And now, our story begins. Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, and a queen sat at her window working, and her embroidery frame was of ebony. And as she worked, gazing at times out on the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood on the snow. And when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself, "As white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the embroidery frame." Not very long after, she had a daughter with a skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was named Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. After a year had gone by, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but proud and overbearing, and she could not bear to be surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic looking glass, and she used to stand before it and look in it and say, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking glass would answer, "You are fairest of them all." and she was contented, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke the truth. Now Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day, when the queen went to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" it answered, "Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White fairer is than you." This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy. And from that hour, her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. And envy and pride, like ill weeds, grew in her heart higher every day, until she had no peace day or night. At last she sent for a huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may set eyes on her no more. You must put her to death, and bring me her heart for a token." The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his cutlass to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and to say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood and never come home again." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Away with you, then, poor child," for he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared to put her to death. Just at that moment, a young wild boar came running by, so he caught and killed it, and taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen for a token. And it was salted and cooked, and the wicked woman ate it up, thinking that there was an end of Snow White. Now, when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even of the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts after her, but they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a little house, and she went inside to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood the little table, ready laid, and covered with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, and 7 knives, and forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup a drop of wine so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that, she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short, but at last the seventh was quite right. And so she lay down upon it, committed herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs whose occupation was to dig underground among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in the little house, they saw that someone must have been in, as everything was not in the same order in which they left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting in my little chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who has been taking my little loaf?" The fourth said, "Who has been tasting my porridge?" The fifth said, "Who has been using my little fork?" The sixth said, "Who has been cutting with my little knife?" The seventh said, "Who has been drinking from my little cup?" Then the first one, looking round, saw a hollow in his bed, and cried, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the others came running and cried, "Someone has been on our beds too." But when the seventh looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White lying there asleep. Then he told the others, who came running up, crying out in their astonishment, and holding up their 7 little candles to throw a light on Snow White. "Oh goodness, oh gracious," cried they, "what beautiful child is this?" And were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. And the 7th dwarf slept with his comrades, an hour at a time with each until the night had passed. When it was morning, and Snow White awoke, and saw the 7 dwarfs, she was very frightened. But they seemed quite friendly, and asked her what her name was, and she told them. And then they asked how she came to be in their house. And she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarfs said, "If you will keep our house for us, and cook, and wash, and make the beds, and sew, and knit, and keep everything tidy and clean, you may stay with us, and you shall lack nothing." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed, and kept the house in good order. In the morning, the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening, they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long, the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know you are here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that now she was the first and fairest. And so she came to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." Then she was very angry, for the glass always spoke the truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought and thought how she could manage to make an end of her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. In this disguise, she went across the 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 little dwarfs, and she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell." Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," answered she, "laces of all colors." And she held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. "I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman," thought Snow White, and she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace. "What a figure you are, child," said the old woman. "Come and let me lace you properly for once." Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood up before her and let her lace her with the new lace. But the old woman laced so quick and tight that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down as dead. "Now you have done with being the fairest," said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here. And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her glass and said, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard that, she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her heart, for she knew that Snow White must still be living. "But now," said she, "I will think of something that will be her ruin." And by witchcraft she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up to look like another different sort of old woman. So she went across the 7 mountains and came to the house of the 7 dwarfs, and knocked at the door and cried, "Good wares to sell, good wares to sell." Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I must not let anybody in." "But you are not forbidden to look," said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door. And when the bargain was made, the old woman said, "Now for once, your hair shall be properly combed." Poor Snow White, thinking no harm, let the old woman do as she would. But no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work, and the poor girl fell down senseless. "Now you paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "this is the end of you," and went off. By good luck, it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as dead, they thought directly that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself and related all that had passed. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard, and never again to let anyone in at the door. And the queen went home and stood before the looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking-glass answered, as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard the looking-glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with anger. "Snow White shall die, cried she, though it should cost me my own life. And then she went to a secret, lonely chamber where no one was likely to come, and there she made a poisonous apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must long for it. But whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs told me not." "All right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere. There, I will give you one." "No," answered Snow White. "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side, I will have the white one." For the apple was so cunningly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead. And the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony, this time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking glass against the wall, "Who is fairest of us all?" "At last," it answered, "you are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart had peace as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground, and there came no breath out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, sought if anything poisonous was to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine. But all was of no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. Then they laid her on a bier, and sat all 7 of them round it, and wept and lamented 3 whole days. And then they would have buried her, but that she looked still as if she were living, with her beautiful, blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the black ground." And they had made a coffin of clear glass so as to be looked into from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch. And the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now, for a long while, Snow White lay in the coffin, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood, and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw on the mountain the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in golden letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you like to ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it me, for I cannot live without looking upon Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you to great honor and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity upon him, and gave him the coffin, and the king's son called his servants, and bid them carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that as they were going along, they stumbled over a bush, and with the shaking, the bit of poisoned apple flew out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, threw up the cover of the coffin, and sat up alive and well. "Oh, dear, where am I?" cried she. The king's son answered full of joy, "You are near me and relating all that had happened," he said. "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind, and went with him, and their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" The looking-glass answered, "O Queen, although you are of beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." Then she railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First, she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her, she knew her for Snow White, and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For they had ready red-hot iron shoes in which she had to dance until she fell down dead. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time, in a quiet village, nestled among rolling hills and shadowed forests, there lived a sweet little girl. She was gentle of heart, quick to smile, and so fair of face that everyone who laid eyes upon her could not help but love her. Yet no one loved her more than her grandmother, who cherished the child beyond measure, and often wondered what gift might next delight her darling grandchild. One winter evening, as the snow fell in soft, white veils upon the rooftops, the grandmother sewed with tender hands a cap of red velvet. She gave it to the girl as a token of her love, and when the child placed it upon her golden hair, it suited her so well that she wished never to take it off. From that day forward, the villagers called her Little Red Riding Hood, and by that name she was known. Time passed, and one morning her mother called her into the kitchen, where a fresh cake cooled upon the table, and a flask of sweet wine glimmered in the light. "Come, Little Red Riding Hood," said the mother. "Your grandmother is ill and weak, and these will do her good. Take them to her cottage in the wood. Greet her kindly, behave with courtesy, and remember, my words do not stray from the path. The woods are wide and full of hidden dangers. Should you fall, the bottle may break, and then there will be nothing left for your poor grandmother." The child nodded solemnly, for she was eager to please. "I will not wander, mother. I will walk straight and swiftly, as you say." The grandmother's cottage stood a half-hour's journey from the village, beneath 3 ancient oaks and behind a hedge of hazel. With her basket upon her arm and her scarlet hood gleaming like a flame among the shadows, the little girl set out. The birds sang above her, the leaves whispered beneath her shoes, and the forest seemed peaceful, yet something stirred unseen among the thickets. It was a wolf, lean and cunning, with yellow eyes that glimmered like coals in the dim light. Though his stomach ached with hunger, he wore a smile upon his snout, for he was a master of deceit. He stepped softly from the trees and bowed his head. "Good day to you, Little Red Riding Hood." "Thank you, Wolf," she replied. thinking no harm of him, for she had never been taught to fear such creatures. Whither so early, fair child, with your cap shining like the dawn? To grandmother's, said the girl. And what do you carry beneath your apron? Cake and wine. My grandmother is ill and weak, and I bring them to strengthen her. We baked only yesterday, and she will be glad. The wolf's eyes gleamed brighter. And where, dear child, does your grandmother dwell? In a cottage beneath the 3 great oaks, a quarter-hour further into the forest, behind the hedge of hazel bushes. Surely you know the place. The wolf thought to himself, a feast beyond measure. First the old woman, then the tender child. How shall I best seize them both? Then he spoke in honeyed tones. See how the sunlight dances upon the moss, and how the flowers sparkle like jewels upon the forest floor. Listen to the birds. Do they not sing more sweetly than church bells? Why hurry along the path as if to school? Take a moment, gather blossoms, make a garland for your grandmother. She will smile to see it. The child lifted her eyes, and for the first time, she truly saw how lovely the woods were. Shafts of gold streamed through the branches, and flowers of every color beckoned her. Indeed, she thought a bouquet will delight grandmother. And it is yet early. I shall not be late. So she ran from the path, gathering one flower after another. Yet each time she bent to pick one another brighter, still seemed to bloom just beyond, and she strayed further and further into the forest's depths. Meanwhile, the wolf wasted no time. He loped swiftly through the undergrowth until he reached the grandmother's house. He knocked upon the door with his paw. "Who is there?" called the frail voice within. Little Red Riding Hood answered the wolf, disguising his growl. "I bring you cake and wine. Open, dear grandmother. Press the latch," she called. "I am too weak to rise." The wolf pressed it, and the door swung wide. Without a moment's pause, he sprang upon the bed and devoured the old woman in a single gulp. Then he pulled on her night clothes, set her cap upon his hairy head, and lay down among the pillows, drawing the curtains close about him. By and by, Little Red Riding Hood returned with her arms full of blossoms. She was surprised to see the door standing open. Inside, the house was strangely still, and a shiver ran down her spine. "Oh, dear," she whispered, "why do I tremble? I have always felt safe here." She stepped softly to the bed and pulled back the curtain. There lay her grandmother, or so it seemed, with the cap pulled low and her face most curious to behold. "Oh, grandmother, what big ears you have! All the better to hear you with my child. And grandmother, what great eyes you have! All the better to see you with. And grandmother, what large hands you have! All the better to seize you with. And grandmother, what a terribly large mouth you have! All the better to eat you with," roared the wolf, and in an instant he leapt from the bed and swallowed her whole. Having feasted, the wolf settled once more into the bed. His belly was heavy, and soon he snored so loudly that the windows rattled. Now it happened that a huntsman was passing by. Hearing the dreadful noise, he thought, "The old woman must be gravely ill, for she snores like a beast." He entered the cottage, and there upon the bed he spied the wolf he had long hunted. He raised his gun, then thought, "Perhaps the grandmother still lives within. I shall not fire." He drew forth a sharp knife and slit the wolf's belly. At once the red hood gleamed forth, and with a few more cuts, Little Red Riding Hood sprang out, crying. Oh, how dark and fearful it was inside. Behind her, the grandmother emerged weak, but alive. Together, they filled the wolf's body with heavy stones. When he awoke and sought to flee, the burden dragged him down, and he fell dead upon the floor. The huntsman took his pelt. The grandmother drank the wine and ate the cake, and Little Red Riding Hood vowed with a solemn heart, "Never again will I stray from the path, nor disobey my mother's words." But the tale does not end here. Another time, when she bore fresh baked goods through the forest, another wolf sought to tempt her from the road. Yet remembering her lesson, Little Red Riding Hood walked straight on, and when she told her grandmother of the wolf's sly words and wicked stare, they barred the door. The beast circled the cottage, climbed upon the roof, and waited to devour her on her journey home. But the grandmother wise in years bade the child fetch water and fill the great stone trough outside. Into it they poured the broth of sausages boiled the day before, and the scent rose rich and savory. The wolf, licking his lips, stretched his neck too far, slipped from the roof, and tumbled headlong into the trough, where he drowned. And so it was that Little Red Riding Hood returned home safe once more, having learned to walk with both innocence and wisdom, and to heed the counsel of those who loved her. Rapunzel, long ago when forests stretched unbroken and villages huddled beneath their shadow, there lived a man and his wife. For many years they had prayed for a child, yet none came. Night after night, the wife lifted her eyes to the stars and begged for mercy. But the heavens remained silent, and her heart grew heavier with longing. At the back of their humble dwelling, there was a narrow window that looked out upon a garden most marvelous to behold. Flowers of every color grew there, and rows of herbs and vegetables thrived as if touched by enchantment. But no mortal dared enter it, for it was enclosed by a high wall of stone, and the garden belonged to a witch of dreadful power. All feared her name, for she was said to weave curses with a glance and bend the will of men like reeds in the wind. One spring evening, as the wife stood at the little window, her gaze fell upon a bed of rampion so green and fresh that it gleamed like jewels among the leaves. A sudden craving seized her fierce as hunger. Day by day she lingered at the window, staring at the rampion, until her face grew pale and her body weak. At last, when her husband asked what troubled her, she whispered with tears, "O husband, unless I taste that rampion in the witch's garden, I fear I shall waste away and die." The man's heart was pierced with sorrow. Better to risk my life, he thought, than lose her to this longing. So when dusk had fallen and shadows veiled the land, he climbed the wall, seized a handful of rampion, and brought it home. His wife prepared a salad at once, and the taste revived her, filling her with a strange delight. But the next morning, her desire returned threefold. Again, she begged her husband, and again, out of love, he scaled the wall. This time, however, as he turned to leave, a terrible voice rang out. From the gloom arose the witch herself, her eyes burning like coals. "How dare you," she shrieked, "creep into my garden like a thief and steal what is mine? For this you shall pay dearly." The man fell to his knees. "Mercy, great lady, I stole only from need. My wife saw your rampion, and grew so sick with longing that she would have perished without it. The witch's anger cooled into cunning. A smile, thin and sharp, curved her lips. "So it shall be," she said. "You may take as much rampion as you please, but on one condition: the child your wife shall soon bear must be given to me. I will raise it as my own." In terror, the man agreed. And when the child was born, the witch appeared, named her Rapunzel, and carried her away. Rapunzel grew into a maiden of surpassing beauty, with hair as fine as spun gold falling in waves to the ground. But the witch, jealous and fearful of losing her, locked the girl away at the age of 12. In the heart of the forest stood a lonely tower, tall and without doors or stairs. Only a single window opened near its top. There, Rapunzel lived, cut off from the world. When the witch wished to visit, she stood below and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then the maiden would loosen the braids of her golden hair, and the witch would climb up as if upon a ladder woven from sunlight. Thus the years passed. Rapunzel, to ease her solitude, sang sweet songs, her voice echoing across the forest like the call of a lark. One day, a young prince hunting nearby heard her singing. He halted enchanted and returned often to listen, though he found no door to the tower. One evening, hidden among the trees, he saw the witch arrive and heard her cry her summons. When Rapunzel's hair tumbled down and the witch climbed aloft, the prince understood the secret. The next night, when dusk had fallen, he ventured forth and called Rapunzel. "Rapunzel, let down your hair." Obediently, the maiden lowered her golden tresses, and the prince ascended. Rapunzel trembled, for she had never seen a man before. But the prince spoke kindly, telling her how her voice had stolen his heart and left him restless until he beheld her. Her fear melted into wonder, and when he asked her to be his wife, she thought, "I like him far better than old Mother Gothel." She laid her hand in his, and her heart was bound to his. Together, they plotted escape. "Bring me skeins of silk each time you come," Rapunzel said, "and I will weave a ladder. When it is finished, I shall descend, and you will bear me away on your horse." Thus, by day, the witch came, and by night the prince visited. But joy cannot stay hidden forever. One day, Rapunzel, in her innocence, asked Mother Gothel, "Why are you so slow to climb when the prince reaches me in but a moment?" The witch's eyes blazed. "What do I hear? False? Child, I thought I had hidden you from all the world. Yet you have betrayed me." In fury, she seized Rapunzel's radiant hair, hacked it off with shears, and cast her into a desolate desert to wander in misery. The witch then fastened the severed braids to the tower window and lay in wait. When the prince came that evening and cried out, the hair was lowered, and he climbed eagerly, only to behold the witch's cruel face. "Ha," she sneered, "you seek your little bird, but the nest is empty. The cat has caught her, and you shall never see her again." Stricken with grief, the prince hurled himself from the tower. Though he escaped with his life, the thorns below pierced his eyes, and he was blinded. In sorrow, he roamed the wilderness for years, living on roots and berries, weeping for his lost love. Meanwhile, Rapunzel dwelt in the desert, where she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She raised them alone, singing to comfort herself and her children. At last, one day, as the prince wandered hopeless, he heard a voice, faint yet familiar. Stumbling toward it, he found Rapunzel, who fell upon his neck in tears. Her weeping bathed his eyes, and by miracle the blindness was washed away. Sight returned to him as clearly as ever. With joy beyond measure, he led Rapunzel and their children to his kingdom. There they were welcomed with delight, and they lived long and happily together, as though sorrow had been but a shadow passing before the dawn. Cinderella. There was once a wealthy man who lived in a fair house at the edge of a deep wood. His wife, who had long been gentle and good, lay upon her bed, stricken with mortal sickness. When she felt her hour of departure was near, she called to her only daughter and bade her draw close. The girl, still but a child, pressed her small hands into her mother's pale ones. With faint breath, the woman whispered, "Dearest child, remain pious and good, and the Almighty will never forsake you. From heaven above I shall watch, and when you weep, I will bend my ear. When you pray, I will kneel beside you. Be steadfast and you shall not walk alone." Having spoken these words, she closed her eyes, and death came softly to her. The maiden wept bitterly day after day, and went each morning to her mother's grave beneath a humble stone. There she knelt, watering the earth with tears, and her heart grew meek and faithful. When winter came, a blanket of white snow covered the mound, as if heaven itself had clothed her mother's rest in purity. When spring returned and melted the snow, the father took himself another wife. This woman brought with her 2 daughters. Fair they seemed to look upon, with bright hair and clear skin, but their hearts were foul and cruel. From the moment they entered the house, they cast evil eyes upon the man's daughter. "Is this dull creature to sit by us?" they sneered. "Shall she eat at our table who earns nothing? Out upon her! She shall be our kitchen maid." At once they stripped her of her gowns of soft cloth, gave her a ragged gray kirtle, and thrust heavy wooden shoes upon her feet. Laughing, they mocked her. "See the proud princess adorned for her throne of ashes." They sent her into the kitchen, where from dawn till dark she labored, drawing water till her arms ached, hauling firewood, stirring pots, washing, scrubbing floors, until her knees were raw. To torment her further, the sisters strewed peas and lentils among the ashes, and commanded her to pick them out, grain by grain. At night, when her body trembled with weariness, she had no bed but the cold hearth, no pillow but the cinders. And because she was always smudged with soot and dust, they named her Cinderella, the Maiden of Ashes. Now one day, her father prepared to travel to the fair. He asked his stepdaughters what gifts they would have. "Fine clothes," cried one. "Pearls and jewels," demanded the other. At last, he turned to Cinderella and said gently, "And you, child, what shall I bring you?" She answered, "Father, bring me the first twig that brushes against your hat upon the road." So he went and bought silks, pearls, and glittering gems for his stepdaughters. On his way home, through a green lane, a hazel twig struck his hat. He broke it off and brought it to Cinderella. She thanked him, and going to her mother's grave, she planted it there. She wept so hard that her tears watered the twig, and from it grew a fine tree. 3 times a day she visited it, weeping and praying. Always a white bird came and perched among the branches. Whatever she desired, the bird cast down to her. Not long after, the king proclaimed a festival to last 3 days, that his son might find a bride. All the maidens of the land were invited. The stepsisters were beside themselves with joy. They called for Cinderella. Comb, our hairbrush, our shoes, fasten our buckles. We must be fair for the feast. When Cinderella heard of the dance, her heart ached sorely. She too longed to go and begged her stepmother leave to attend. But the woman scoffed. What, you, in your soot and rags, you who have no dress, no shoes, and no grace for dancing? The feast is not for such as you. Yet when the girl pleaded, still her stepmother said slyly, I have emptied a dish of lentils into the ashes. If you can pick them out within 2 hours, you may come with us. Cinderella slipped into the garden and called softly, Gentle doves, O turtle doves, and all the birds that be, the lentils that in ashes lie, come and pick up for me. The good must be put in the dish, the bad you may eat if you wish. Then 2 white doves flew in at the window, followed by turtle doves, and at last a cloud of little birds from under heaven. They perched among the ashes, nodding their heads, and began to peck, pick, peck, pick, peck, until the dish was filled with clean lentils. In less than an hour, all was done, and they flew away. Joyfully, Cinderella brought the dish, thinking now she might go, but her stepmother sneered, No, child, you have no proper dress, and you cannot dance. You would be mocked. And when Cinderella wept, she scattered 2 more dishes of lentils in the ashes, thinking, This time she will fail. But again the maiden called the birds, and again they came fluttering and pecked until both dishes were filled before half an hour had passed. Still, the cruel woman refused. Is of no use. You shall not go. We would be shamed. Then she hastened away with her 2 proud daughters. Alone in the house, Cinderella ran to her mother's grave beneath the hazel tree and cried, little tree, shake over me, that silver and gold may come down and cover me. At once the bird cast down a gown of shimmering silver and gold, and slippers embroidered with silk and silver thread. Hastily she dressed and went to the festival. None knew her, for she looked like a princess from a far-off land. The king's son took her by the hand, danced with her alone, and would not let another partner near. When evening came, she slipped away. The prince followed, but she sprang into the pigeon house. The father summoned, hewed it down with axe and hatchet, but inside was no one, for Cinderella had already fled to her hazel tree, laid aside her dress, and sat once more in ashes. On the second night, the bird gave her a gown more splendid still, and again she bewitched all eyes. The prince would dance with none but her, yet when she fled, she climbed a pear tree, nimble as a squirrel. Again her father chopped the tree down, and again she sat in her kitchen in rags. On the third night, the bird gave her a gown brighter than stars and slippers of pure gold. The prince was bewitched utterly. But as she fled, he had ordered the steps to be smeared with pitch, and her golden slipper remained stuck fast. The next day, he declared, "None shall be my bride, but she whose foot fits this golden shoe." The stepsisters rejoiced, for they had dainty feet. The eldest, urged by her mother, cut off her toe to force her foot inside. The prince, deceived, rode away with her, but the doves at the hazel tree cried, "There they go, there they go. There is blood on her shoe. The shoe is too small, not the right bride at all." Looking down, the prince saw blood flowing. He turned back. Then the younger sister cut off part of her heel. Again, the prince was deceived, and again the doves cried their warning. The blood betrayed her too. At last Cinderella was summoned. She washed her hands and face, slipped her foot into the golden shoe, and it fitted as though made for her. When she stood, the prince knew her face and cried, "She is my bride." The stepmother and sisters turned pale with fury, but the prince lifted Cinderella onto his horse. As they passed the hazel tree, the doves cried, "There they go, there they go. No blood on her shoe. The shoe's not too small. The right bride is she after all?" They flew after her and perched upon her shoulders, one on the right, one on the left, and stayed with her ever after. But the stepsisters who came to the wedding feast, hoping to share her fortune, met their doom. As they walked in the bridal procession, one on the right, one on the left, the doves pecked out an eye of each. And when they returned, the doves took the other eyes, so that for all their days they groped in darkness, punished for wickedness and deceit. And thus the Maiden of Ashes became queen, rewarded for her faith, her tears, and her steadfast heart. Sleeping Beauty. In a time long faded from memory, there lived a mighty king and a gentle queen, who, though surrounded by riches, servants, and a kingdom vast, carried within their hearts a great sorrow, for no child had been granted them. Each morning and evening they clasped hands and whispered, "Would that heaven bless us with a child, even if but once." Yet the cradle stood empty, and hope seemed but a shadow. But one day, as the queen bathed in a marble pool, whose waters ran clear from the mountain springs, a curious frog leapt forth from the depths. Its eyes shone like tiny emeralds, and its voice, though strange, carried a weight of prophecy. It croaked, "Your wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has passed, you shall bring into the world a daughter, fairer than the rose and brighter than the dawn." And so it came to pass. The queen bore a daughter whose beauty was such that the king's heart overflowed with joy. He proclaimed a feast of such splendor that none in the kingdom could remember its like. Invitations went forth to kin noble friends, loyal subjects, and most importantly, to the wise women who guarded ancient gifts of fate and fortune. In that realm, there were 13 of these women, yet only 12 golden plates had the king prepared for. He had not thought beyond his store of treasure. Thus, one of the wise women, unbidden, was left out. The banquet was grand, with music that rang like silver bells, and tables laden with meats, fruits, and wines from every corner of the land. When the feasting waned, the wise women came forth in solemn order to bestow blessings upon the infant princess. One granted virtue, another beauty, a third wealth, a fourth kindness. So they spoke in turn until 11 had spoken. Each word shimmered about the child like threads of unseen gold. Then, with a sound like the crack of thunder, the 13th wise woman burst into the hall. Her garments were dark as storm clouds, and her face burned with fury at her exclusion. Without bow or greeting, she cried, "Hear me! In her 15th year, this child shall prick her finger upon a spindle and fall down dead." With that she turned, and like a shadow was gone. A hush fell upon the court, terror freezing every heart. Then the 12th wise woman, whose gift remained unspoken, stepped forward. Though she could not undo the curse, she softened it with words of mercy. The maiden shall not die, but fall into a sleep deep as the grave, lasting 100 years. At the end of that time, she shall awaken. To guard his daughter, the king decreed that all spindles in the realm be gathered and burned. Yet fate weaves finer threads than kings may sever. The princess grew graced by all the gifts of heaven. She was fair, gentle of speech, clever in thought, and so kind that none could gaze upon her without love. On the day she reached her 15th year, the king and queen rode out, leaving her alone in the castle. Curiosity led her wandering through chambers, bright and dim, until at last she came to a narrow stair spiraling upward into an ancient tower. At the top stood a small door with a rusty key. She turned it, and inside sat an old woman spinning flax with a spindle. "Good day, mother," said the princess. "I spin, child," answered the woman. "And what is this thing that whirls so swiftly?" asked the maiden, reaching forth. She grasped the spindle, and in that instant pricked her finger. At once her eyes closed, and she sank upon a bed nearby, falling into slumber. The spell spread like mist. The king and queen, returning to the hall, fell into sleep where they stood. Courtiers slumbered at their posts, horses in their stalls, hounds in the yard, pigeons on the roof. Even the fire upon the hearth grew still. The cook froze, with his hand raised against the scullion, who too sank into dreams. Not a breath stirred, not a leaf trembled. Silence reigned. Round about the castle there sprang a hedge of thorns, which grew with each passing year, until it was taller than towers, thicker than walls, and so tangled that no mortal eye could see the castle, save the vane glimmering faintly above. Tales spread through the land of a princess named Rosamond, sleeping beneath enchantment. Princes came from far and wide, seeking glory. but the thorns clutched them like cruel hands. Many perished there, pierced and strangled their bones, hidden in the hedge. 100 years passed. Then there came a young king's son, who heard from a gray-bearded peasant of the sleeping princess and the fate of all who sought her. The old man warned him, "Many have gone, none have returned." But the prince answered, "I do not fear. I shall behold her with mine own eyes." For the appointed hour had come, and destiny was ripe. When he approached the hedge, the thorns bloomed into great blossoms, sweet-scented, which bent aside and let him through. Within the courtyard lay the hounds and horses, still as stone pigeons, with heads beneath their wings. He entered the hall and found the court asleep, the king and queen upon their thrones, servants frozen in motion. All was so still that he heard his own breath echo. At last he reached the tower. He turned the door and saw the maiden lying there, fair as morning light, her chest rising gently in sleep. He gazed long upon her, and love kindled in his heart. He bent low, and with a kiss he touched her lips. Then the spell broke. Rosamond stirred her eyes, opening clear and bright. She looked kindly upon the prince, and rising took his hand. Throughout the castle, life awoke the king and queen, blinked in wonder. The court stirred. The hounds, barked pigeons, flew into the fields. The cook struck the scullion, who cried aloud, and the fire leapt again upon the hearth. Soon after the wedding of Rosamond and the prince was celebrated with great joy and splendor. Bells rang, feasts were held, and music soared. And the prince and Rosamond lived side by side in happiness until their lives' gentle end. Rumpelstiltskin. Once in a quiet valley, where the river turned the great wheel of an old mill, lived a miller who was poor in coin, but proud in spirit. Though his purse was light, he had one treasure greater than all, a daughter of rare beauty, with hair like ripened wheat, and eyes that shone as if they had stolen their hue from the summer sky. Her gentle manners were praised in every cottage. Roundabout, yet fortune had given her no dowry, save her loveliness and her father's boastful tongue. Now it chanced one day that this miller found himself summoned before the king. Eager to seem a man of worth and consequence, He sought to impress his sovereign. So in his folly, he said, "My daughter is not only fair, but so clever with her hands that she can spin straw into pure gold." These words, meant only to puff himself up, slipped from his lips like sparks from a careless fire. The king, who loved gold more than meat or drink, pricked up his ears at once. His gaze grew sharp, and he said, "If thy daughter is as clever as thou claimest, bring her to my castle at dawn. I shall put her skill to proof." The miller, trembling, bowed low, though his heart quaked within him. So it was that the very next morning the girl was taken to the royal halls. Without tender word or kindly smile, the king led her to a chamber high in the tower. From floor to ceiling, the room was filled with straw more than any maiden might spin in a lifetime. In the center stood a wheel and spindle. Then the king said, with cold command, "Set thy hands to work at once. If by sunrise this straw be not turned to gold, thou shalt die." With that, he locked the heavy door and left her alone. Alone, she sat, the poor miller's daughter, her hands trembling upon the spindle. Not the cleverest soul on earth could have drawn gold from straw, and she had never learned the art of spinning more than simple thread. Her heart sank, and tears flowed down her cheeks until her sobbing filled the room. But when the clock struck midnight, the latch of the door lifted of its own accord, and a strange little man entered. He was scarcely half her height, with eyes bright as coals, and he bowed with uncanny courtesy. "Good evening, miller's daughter," said he. "Why weepest thou so bitterly?" "Alas," she cried, "the king has commanded me to spin this straw into gold, and I know not how. If I fail, I must die." The little man tilted his head and said, "What wilt thou give me if I spin it for thee?" "My necklace," said she, for it was her only ornament. He took it, seated himself at the wheel, and whir, whir, whir round went the spindle, swift as the wind. Straw vanished, golden thread gleamed, and bobbin after bobbin filled until the whole room shone like a treasury. At dawn, the king returned his eyes, greedy with delight. He praised not the girl, but only the gold, and ordered her into a second chamber, larger than the first, and heaped higher with straw. Again, he commanded, spin this straw into gold in a single night, or thou shalt die. That night, the little man returned once more. What wilt thou give me this time, if I help thee? The ring from my finger, said the girl, and so it was. Again the wheel sang through the hours, and by morning the chamber overflowed with golden thread. The king's joy knew no bounds, yet his hunger for riches was never sated. On the third night, he led her into the largest chamber of all, filled to bursting with straw. This too must be spun into gold, he said, and if thou accomplish it, thou shalt become my queen. For though thou art but a miller's daughter, I shall never find one richer in all the world. When the door closed, the little man came again. What wilt thou give me if I do this for thee? I have nothing left, whispered the girl in despair. Then promise me, said he, his voice sly as a snake, thy firstborn child when thou art queen. The poor maiden shuddered. Yet what choice had she? Death stood on one side, the king's command on the other. She gave her word. At once the little man set to work, and by morning all the straw was gold. The king, rejoicing, married her, and so the miller's daughter was made queen. A year passed, and she bore a fair child. She had long forgotten the strange bargain, until one night the little man crept into her chamber. Now, O queen, said he, give me what thou hast promised. The queen was struck with terror and clutched her child close. She offered him all the treasures of the kingdom, if only he would spare her little one. But the man shook his head. Nay, better a living thing than all the gold of earth. Still, I will show mercy. I shall give thee 3 days. If in that time thou canst discover my name, thou mayest keep thy child. The queen spent the first night whispering names until her lips were dry. She sent messengers across the land to gather every name ever heard. When the little man came, she spoke them all: Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and 100 more. But always he shook his head. That is not my name. On the second night, she tried stranger titles, names of beasts and twisted shapes, roast ribs, sheep shanks, spindle shanks. But the little man only laughed. That is not my name. On the third night, her messenger returned. He said, in the forest by a high hill, I came upon a tiny hut. Before it, a fire burned, and around the fire danced a comical little man. He hopped on one leg and sang, "Today I bake, tomorrow I brew." The next day, the queen's child comes due. Oh, I am glad that none can claim that Rumpelstiltskin is my name. The queen's heart leapt for joy when the little man came and asked, "Now, O queen, what is my name?" She first teased him. "Art thou called Jack? Number Harry, perhaps?" "No." Then she said with triumph bright in her eyes, "Then perchance thy name is Rumpelstiltskin." At these words, the little man shrieked as though stabbed. "The devil hath told thee. The devil hath told thee," he cried. In his rage, he stamped his foot so deep that it sank into the earth up to his knee. Seizing his other leg in fury, he pulled and tugged until he split himself in two. Thus ended Rumpelstiltskin, and the queen kept her child. And so it is told to this day, pride may lead men to boast greed, may bind kings to cruelty, but cunning cannot hide forever. For sooner or later, every secret name is spoken. Hansel and Gretel, near the edge of a vast and shadow-haunted forest, there dwelt a poor woodcutter, his stern wife, and two small children. The boy was called Hansel, the girl Gretel. Their cottage was meager, their cupboard nearly bare, and in a season of famine that swept across the land, even the daily crust of bread could no longer be won. Hunger gnawed at their bellies by day and haunted their dreams by night. One evening, when the father tossed sleepless upon his straw bed, he groaned aloud, "What shall become of us? Our children cry for food, yet our hands are empty. There is no bread, not even a scrap of crust left in the bin." His wife turned her cold eyes toward him and whispered, harsh as the crack of dry wood, "I will tell you what must be done. At dawn, we shall lead the children deep into the forest, into the thickest part where no path returns. We shall give each a small piece of bread, then abandon them by the fire. They will never find their way home, and thus we shall be rid of them." The man shuddered. "No, wife, my heart cannot endure such cruelty. To leave them among wolves and wild beasts. Better we perish together then feed the forest with our children's bones. But the woman mocked him, then sharpen 4 stakes and carve our coffins, for soon we shall all starve. You weak fool, will you let sentiment drag us all into the grave? So relentless was her tongue that the man's spirit faltered, and he gave way, though grief weighed on him like an axe of stone. Stones in the moonlight, Hansel and Gretel, lying wakeful with empty stomachs, overheard every word. Gretel wept bitterly. Brother, we are lost, doomed to die in the forest. But Hansel put his arm about her and whispered with quiet faith, Do not fear, little sister. I will think of something. God will not forsake us. When the house was sunk in slumber, Hansel rose, donned his coat, and crept outside. The moon shone clear, and the pale stones scattered before the hut glittered like silver coins spilled from heaven's purse. He bent low, gathered his pockets full, and returned to bed. Rest now, Gretel. Sleep in peace. Tomorrow you shall see what I mean. The first journey into the forest. At the break of day, the woman woke them roughly. Rise, you idlers. We go to the forest to cut wood. She gave each a thin slice of bread. That is for your dinner. Do not eat it sooner, for you will have no more. Hansel slipped his into his pocket, already heavy with stones. On the path, he often lagged behind, turning his head to look back at the cottage. What do you gaze at, Hansel asked the father. I am looking at my white kitten upon the roof, who waves me farewell. Simpleton, cried the wife. That is no cat, only the morning sun flashing on the chimney. But Hansel, each time he turned, dropped one of his shining stones upon the ground. At last they reached the heart of the forest. A fire was kindled, and the mother said, Sit here, children, warm yourselves, and rest. We go deeper to hew wood. When we are ready, we shall return. Hansel and Gretel sat by the crackling blaze, ate their dry bread, and listened to what they thought was the father chopping wood. Yet it was only the wind tossing a dead branch. At length, weary with hunger, they slept. Night fell cold and deep. Gretel woke first and sobbed. How shall we ever find our way home? But Hansel comforted her. Wait for the moon, sister. Then you shall see. And when the round moon rose, its light struck upon the white stones, gleaming like a silver path through the darkness. Hand in hand, the children followed the trail, walking the whole night until at dawn, the familiar cottage stood before them. Their father's heart leapt with joy, though the woman scolded harshly. The second betrayal, yet famine still reigned. Soon the cruel wife whispered once more, "We have only half a loaf left. After that, the end. Again we must cast them off, this time farther, deeper where no return is possible." The man groaned, "Better to share our last morsel with the children." But she overbore him with bitter words, and he yielded. Hansel and Gretel, sleepless and hollow-eyed, overheard again. Hansel slipped from bed to fetch stones, but the door had been locked. Still, he whispered, "Do not despair, Gretel. God will help us." Next morning, each child received a piece of bread smaller than before. On the way, Hansel crumbled his portion into tiny bits, letting them fall upon the path. When asked what he stared at, he answered, "A little dove sits on the roof to bid me farewell." The woman snarled, "That is no dove, but the morning sun." They were led deeper than ever into a part of the forest unknown. Another fire was kindled. Again the parents departed. Again the children slept. At night, Hansel urged, "Wait, sister, till the moon rises. Then we shall see the crumbs I have scattered." But when the moon lifted her pale face, there was nothing. Every crumb had been eaten by the birds of the wood. Lost, they wandered through night and day, gnawing wild berries, stumbling with weakness. On the third day, faint with hunger, they sank beneath a tree, and there might have died had not a snow-white bird alighted, singing sweetly. When they followed, it led them to a strange little house, the house of bread. The walls were baked of bread, the roof shingled with cake, the windows glazed with clear sugar. Hansel cried, "Look, Gretel, a banquet sent from heaven. I shall eat a piece of the roof, and you may nibble the window pane." But as they ate, a thin voice sang from within, "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, who is gnawing at my house?" Hansel answered quickly, "Only the wind, only the wind." They went on eating until the door opened, and an ancient woman appeared leaning on a crutch. Her eyes were red as burning coals. Her smile stretched wide and strange, yet her voice was honeyed. "Dear children, come inside. You must be cold and hungry. Here is milk and pancakes and apples and nuts aplenty. Within they found a table laden and soft white beds to rest in. Thinking themselves in paradise, they lay down and slept. But the old woman was a witch who built her sugared house to lure children. Her eyes, though weak, could smell the nearness of human flesh like a wolf. That night, she laughed to herself. Now I have them. They shall not escape. The witch's snare. At dawn she seized Hansel, dragged him to a small cage, and locked the iron bars. However, he cried and pleaded. It was no use. Then she shook Grethel awake. Up, lazy bones. Fetch water and cook something good for your brother. He shall be fattened, and when he is plump enough, I shall eat him. Grethel wept bitterly, but fear forced her to obey. From then on, Hansel received rich meals, while Grethel lived on scraps and shells. Each morning, the witch croaked, Hansel, put out your finger, that I may feel if you are fat yet. But Hansel held out a little bone he had found. Her failing eyes deceived her, and she wondered why he never grew plumper. After 4 weeks, her patience broke. Fat or lean, tomorrow you die, she cried. Fire and deliverance. Early next morning, she ordered Grethel to heat the oven. We shall bake first, then feast. Creep in, girl, and see if it is hot enough. But Grethel, sensing her wicked plan, feigned ignorance. I do not know how to look inside. Stupid goose, hissed the witch. The hole is wide enough, see I could creep in myself. And she thrust her head forward. Quick as lightning, Grethel pushed her hard and slammed the door shut, dropping the iron bolt. The witch howled and shrieked, but the flames consumed her, and her cries died away in smoke. Grethel ran to Hansel, unlocked his cage, and shouted, We are free! The witch is dead. Hansel sprang out like a bird from its prison. They embraced, wept, laughed, and danced about. Searching the house, they found chests of pearls, jewels, and gold. Hansel stuffed his pockets, and Grethel filled her apron. The journey home. They set out, but soon came to a wide stream. No bridge, no stepping stones, no boat was there. Then a white duck swam toward them. Gretel called Duck, Duck, so mild and good, carry us over the water and wood. No bridge, no stone, no wooden beam, bear us across on your snowy stream. The duck obeyed. Hansel crossed first, then Gretel. Onward they went until the woods grew familiar. At last their father's cottage stood before them. The man who had not known a single hour of peace since leaving them clasped them with tears of joy. The cruel wife was dead. Hansel poured handfuls of jewels upon the floor, and Gretel spilled pearls from her apron until the room gleamed. So all care ended, and they lived together in joy and plenty. My tale is told. Run, little mouse, run, and whoever can catch it may weave from its fur a cap both warm and fine. The wolf and the 7 young kids. Once in a quiet valley where the grass grew tall and the brook sang through mossy stones, there lived an old goat. She was a tender mother, and her heart clung to her 7 little ones as tightly as ivy clings to a wall. Each was different. One nimble one, timid one, merry one, bold. But to her, they were all treasures, as precious as pearls in a crown. One morning, as the sun poured gold through the branches, the mother goat gathered her children round her. "My dear little ones," said she today, "I must wander into the deep wood to fetch herbs and sweet leaves for our supper. While I am gone, take heed. The wolf roams near that dark trickster who devours without pity. If he should creep into this house, he would eat you, whole skin, bones, and heart. He is a master of deceit, but you may always know him by 2 signs. His voice is rough and hoarse, and his paws are black as soot. Fear not, mother, bleated the little goats in chorus. We shall watch and guard the door. No wolf shall trick us. Then the mother kissed each tender, head bleated her farewell, and trotted away with an easy mind. But scarcely had her shadow faded among the trees when a heavy knock came at the cottage door. A gruff voice cried out, "Open, open, my dear children. Your mother has returned and brought each of you a gift." At once, the kids pricked their ears, for the voice was deep and hoarse. "We will not open the door," cried they. "You are not our mother. Her voice is gentle and sweet, while yours is harsh. You must be the wolf. And they stayed hidden inside. The wolf gnashed his teeth in anger, yet he was cunning. He hurried to the village and bought a lump of chalk, which he chewed to make his voice soft. Then he came again and knocked. "Open the door, my dear children," he called, his tone now smooth as cream. "Your mother is come home and has brought each of you something from the wood." But as he pressed his paws against the window, the little ones saw his great black claws. "We will not open," they cried again. "Our mother's paws are not black like yours. You are the wolf, furious." The wolf ran to the baker. "Smear my paws with dough," said he, "for they are hurt." And the baker, though doubtful, obeyed. Then he ran to the miller. "Dust my paws white with flour." The miller hesitated, for he guessed some evil was afoot. "I will not," said he. But the wolf bared his fangs and snarled, "Do it, or I shall swallow you whole." Trembling, the miller obeyed. And that shows how fear bends men to wickedness. So the wolf returned once more and knocked for the third time. "Open, dear children. Your mother has come home and brings you each a gift." "Show us your paws," cried the kids, still cautious. He lifted them to the window, and lo, they were white as snow. Believing the lie, the little ones unlatched the door. In he sprang, the dreadful wolf. The kids shrieked and scattered like leaves in a storm. One darted under the table. Another leapt into the bed. A third hid in the oven. A fourth dashed into the kitchen. A fifth scrambled into the cupboard. The sixth crept under the sink, and the seventh squeezed into the tall clock case. But the wolf was swift and merciless. One by one, he dragged them out, swallowed them whole, and laughed with a belly full of wriggling prey. Only the youngest in the clock case escaped his jaws. Satisfied, the wolf waddled into the meadow, his stomach heavy with his feast. Beneath a broad tree, he lay down, and soon he was snoring so loudly that the branches quivered. Not long after, the mother goat returned. But what a sight awaited her! The door swung wide, the chairs overturned, the dishes shattered, the bed torn apart. She called each child by name, but no answer came, until at last a faint little voice replied from the clock case, "Here I am, dear mother." She drew out her youngest, who told her all with trembling words how the wolf had tricked them, how he had swallowed the others whole. The mother wept bitter tears, her heart pierced with grief. She wandered with her last child into the meadow, and there she beheld the wolf snoring beneath the tree. His belly bulged and stirred as though something inside still moved. "Oh, heaven," thought she, "can it be my poor little ones live yet within that beast?" Quickly, she sent the youngest back for scissors, needle and thread. With steady hands, she cut open the wolf's great belly. Scarcely had she snipped when the head of one little kid popped out alive and gasping. Then another and another, until all 6 leapt forth unharmed, for the wolf had gulped them whole in his greed. How they danced and kissed their mother, filling the meadow with cries of joy. "Now," said the mother, her eyes flashing, "fetch me heavy stones." And they did so in haste. One by one, they filled the wolf's belly with the hard rocks, and she stitched him up so neatly that he never stirred. At length, the wolf awoke. Thirsty, he dragged himself to the brook, but the stones clattered inside him, striking bone against bone. "What is this I feel within me, knocking hard against my bones?" Kids that leapt so sprightly now are stones as heavy stones. He stooped to drink, but the weight dragged him down. With a crash and a splash, he fell into the water and was drowned. When the 7 little goats saw it, they ran to their mother, shouting, "The wolf is dead! The wolf is dead!" And hand in hand, they danced about her in the sunlight, their laughter ringing through the valley as the old goat's heart rested at last in peace. The golden goose. Once in a quiet village, nestled between fields and forest, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and 3 sons. The eldest was strong and thought himself clever. The second was shrewd and sharp of tongue. But the youngest, who was small, awkward, and dreamy, was called the simpleton. All mocked him. His brothers laughed. His parents despaired, and the neighbors shook their heads. For whenever he tried to help, he stumbled. Whenever he spoke, others dismissed him. And so, day after day, he was despised. laughed at, and neglected. One morning, the eldest son rose early and said, "Father, today I shall prove my strength. I will go into the forest and cut wood." His mother, proud of him, packed for him a fine meal, a golden brown pancake thick with butter, and a flask of rich red wine to warm him in the cold shadows of the wood. Thus provisioned, he set off with a confident stride. Deep in the forest, he came upon a little old gray man, bent and wrinkled, with kind but weary eyes. The man greeted him, "Good day, good youth. I am hungry and thirsty from my wandering. Pray share a bite of your cake and a sip of your wine." But the eldest scowled and answered sharply, "Share with you. Then what should I eat myself? Be off, old beggar." He turned away, leaving the little man standing sorrowful in the shade of the trees. Yet hardly had he set his axe to a trunk when he struck awry. The blade glanced and bit into his own arm. The wound bled deep. He could not work, but was forced to stagger home in shame. That was the consequence of scorning the little gray man. Soon after, the second son declared that he too would go to the forest. His mother gave him a pancake and a flask, and with proud words sent him off. As with his brother, the little gray man appeared, greeted him, and begged humbly for a morsel and a sip. But the second son curled his lip. "Why should I lessen my portion for you? What I give you, I lose myself. Go your way, old fool." And proud of his clever refusal, he strode on. But punishment followed swiftly as he hewed at a tree. The axe slipped and cut deep into his leg, so that he collapsed and had to be carried home, groaning by the villagers. At last, the simpleton said timidly, "Father, let me go for once into the forest to cut wood." His father laughed bitterly. "Your brothers, who are skilled and strong, have both hurt themselves. You poor fool will fare no better. Stay at home." But the boy pleaded with such gentle insistence that finally the father relented. "Very well. Go and learn by experience. Perhaps pain will teach you what sense cannot." The mother sighed, and for him she baked no fine cake, but only a rough round of dough mixed with water, baked in the ashes until hard. To this she added a flask of sour beer. "There," she said, That is fitting for such a one as you." Yet the simpleton took it gratefully and set off. In the forest, as before, the little old gray man appeared. His eyes, though weary, seemed to glimmer with hidden light. "Good day, kind youth. I am faint with hunger and thirst. Will you share a piece of your cake and a drink from your flask?" The simpleton bowed his head and said, "I have only a poor cake of ash bread and a flask of sour beer. But if that pleases you, let us sit together and share." So they sat on a mossy stone, and when the boy broke the coarse cake, lo, it became a golden pancake, rich and sweet. And when he raised the flask, it held fragrant wine. They ate and drank, and the little man smiled. "Because you have shown me kindness where your brothers showed me scorn, I will bestow good fortune upon you. There stands an old tree. Cut it down, and among its roots you will find a treasure." With that, the little man vanished as mist before the sun. The simpleton hastened to the tree, swung his awl with steady strokes, and when the trunk fell, he beheld a marvel. There, nestled among the roots, was a goose with feathers of pure gold, gleaming brighter than the noonday sun. He lifted it gently, astonished, and carried it to a nearby inn where he planned to spend the night. Now the innkeeper had 3 daughters, curious and covetous. When they saw the golden goose, their hearts burned with desire for a feather each. The eldest, waiting for a moment, when the simpleton left the room, crept forward and seized the goose by its wing. But instantly her hand stuck fast, as though glued by unseen force. The second sister, eager not to be outdone, reached to pull her away. But the moment she touched her, she too was held fast. Then came the third, who laughed at their cries. "Why should I not have a feather as well?" She grasped her sister's skirt, and at once she too was bound. All 3 stood clinging helplessly to the goose. In the morning, the simpleton tucked the golden goose under his arm and set out, paying no heed to the 3 maidens who clung behind, stumbling and wailing. Through field and meadow he walked, and behind him trailed the strange procession. A parson passing by cried out, "Shame upon you maidens, to chase after a youth in such fashion." He seized the youngest by the hand to drag her away. But the instant he touched her, he too was caught, and had to follow. Soon came the sexton, astonished to see the parson in such plight. "Your reverence," he cried, "have you lost your dignity?" He grasped the parson's sleeve and was fastened as well. Then 2 peasants hoeing in the field came running at the parson's call for help. But when they laid hands on the others, they too were bound. So now 7 souls trooped behind the simpleton, and his goose, step for step, through villages and lanes, to the laughter of all who saw. At length they came to a great town where a king reigned, who had a daughter, fair but solemn. She was famed for her beauty, but also for her sorrowful silence, for none had ever seen her smile. The king proclaimed that whoever could make her laugh should win her hand in marriage. Princes, nobles, and jesters had tried in vain. When the simpleton entered with his goose and his train of 7 clinging figures, the princess beheld the sight and burst into such laughter that it rang like silver bells through the hall. She laughed until she wept and could not stop. And so, by the king's decree, the simpleton had earned her hand. But the king, proud and unwilling to give his daughter to a poor fool, devised new trials. First, he said, "Bring me a man who can drink a whole cellar of wine." The simpleton went into the forest, and there he found a man groaning in thirst. "I have drunk a whole cask, yet my throat burns still." The simpleton led him to the king's cellar, where the man drank and drank until every vat was dry. Still, the king objected. "Now bring me a man who can eat a mountain of bread." Again, the simpleton returned to the forest, and there found a starving man bound by a strap. "I have devoured a bakehouse, yet I am empty still." The simpleton brought him to the king's courtyard, where a mountain of bread awaited. In one day, he ate it all. Yet again, the king sought to delay. "Fetch me a ship that can sail alike on land and water. Only then shall you have my daughter." The simpleton sought the forest once more, and the little gray man appeared. "I have helped you drink and eat," said he, "and now I will help you once more, for you showed me kindness when none else would. Here is the ship that sails both land and sea." The simpleton sailed it proudly to the palace gates. Seeing this, the king could resist no longer. The marriage was held with great rejoicing, and when the king died, the simpleton became king in his stead, ruling wisely with his beloved queen by his side. Thus, the despised fool, through kindness and patience, rose to honor and happiness, and lived long in peace. Snow White and Rose Red. There once lived a poor widow in a lonely little cottage at the edge of a vast forest. Before her door stretched a modest garden, and in its center grew 2 rose trees, one bearing blossoms as white as fallen snow, the other as red as a maiden's lips. This widow had 2 daughters who were like those rose trees in spirit and in beauty. The elder, calm and gentle, was called Snow White. The younger, lively and merry, was named Rose Red. The children, though different in temper, were alike in goodness, diligence, and cheer. Rose Red loved to wander through meadows and along forest paths, chasing butterflies, braiding daisies into garlands, and laughing at the song of larks. Snow White, by contrast, was content to remain close to her mother, helping with the humblest tasks of the household, spinning wool by the hearth, or reading softly from an old book whose letters glowed like mysteries in the firelight. Yet never did their differences make them quarrel, for their hearts were twined as closely as the 2 rose trees in the garden. Whenever they set out together, they clasped hands so tightly that no power could part them. "We will never leave each other," Snow White would whisper, and Rose Red would answer, "Never so long as we live." Their mother, hearing this, would smile and say, "What one has must belong to the other." The forest knew them well. They gathered berries without fear, for no wild creature ever harmed them. The hare hopped boldly to nibble cabbage leaves from their palms. The gentle roe deer grazed beside them. Even the proud stag bounded past in play, while the little birds perched above and sang as though the sisters were their chosen audience. If the sun set while they lingered too long, they lay down together on a mossy bed, slept soundly under the open sky, and awoke with the dawn unharmed. Once indeed, when morning came, they saw a fair child, clothed in shining white garments, sitting near their mossy couch. He looked kindly upon them, but spoke not, and vanished into the trees. When they turned about, they beheld with trembling that they had slumbered on the very edge of a precipice. One step more in the dark, and they would have fallen. Their mother told them it was surely an angel who guards the innocent. At home, their little cottage shone with care. In summer, rose red adorned her mother's bed with wreaths of flowers, always placing one white and one red rose among them. In winter, Snow White polished the copper kettle until it gleamed like gold, lit the fire, and warmed the room against the snow. Evenings were happiest of all. Their mother read aloud from her great book, while the girls span flax with nimble fingers. At their feet rested a lamb, gentle and white, while a dove perched behind them, with its head tucked beneath its wing. One such evening, while snowflakes drifted outside, there came a heavy knock at the door. "Quick, Rose Red," said the mother. "Open it must be a traveler seeking shelter." Rose Red hastened to draw the bolt, but instead of a weary man, there thrust in a great shaggy head, black as midnight. Startled, Rose Red screamed, the lamb bleated, the dove fluttered, and Snow White darted behind the bed. Yet the bear spoke in a deep, rough voice. "Do not fear. I mean you no harm. I am half frozen and only seek warmth by your fire." "Poor creature," said the mother gently, "come in and lie by the hearth, but take care not to singe your coat." Then she called her daughters forth. Slowly, Snow White and Rose Red crept nearer, and the lamb and dove grew calm again. They fetched a broom and brushed the snow from the bear's thick fur. Soon he stretched out before the fire, growling in contentment. Before long, the children were laughing with him, tugging at his ears, rolling upon his back, and even tapping him with hazel twigs. When their play grew too rough, he cried in mock reproach, "Snowy White, Rosy Red, will you strike your lover dead?" The sisters giggled until their sides ached. At night, the bear slept upon the hearth, and in the morning, the children unbolted the door that he might trot back into the forest. From then on, he returned each evening, and the doors were never fastened until their black-furred friend had entered. But when spring spread its green mantle over the earth, the bear rose one morning and said gravely to Snow White, Now I must go, and shall not return until winter." "Where go you, dear?" Bear asked she. "I must guard my treasure from the wicked dwarfs," he answered. "While the ground is frozen, they cannot pierce it. But now, when the earth is soft, they creep out to steal, and what they seize is rarely seen again." Sorrowfully, the sisters unbarred the door. As he pressed through the latch, caught upon his fur, and tore it, and for an instant Snow White thought she glimpsed gleaming gold beneath. But before she could be sure, the bear hurried away into the forest shadows. Not long after, the widow sent her children to fetch firewood. There they found a tree split upon the ground, and struggling near it, a strange little man, a dwarf with a beard white as snow and long as a yard. His beard was caught fast in a crevice of the trunk, and he leapt and raged like a fox in a snare. With eyes red as embers, he shrieked, "Why stand you gaping? Will you not help me?" The girls tried to pull the beard free, but it was held too tightly. "I will fetch help," said Rose Red. "Foolish goose," screeched the dwarf. But Snow White, quick-witted, drew her scissors and snipped off the end of the beard, freed the dwarf, seized a sack of gold hidden among the roots, snarling, "Barbarous children, to spoil my noble beard," and vanished without thanks. Twice more they met him, once by the brook where his beard was tangled in a fishing line, and again upon the heath where an eagle had seized him in its talons. Each time the sisters saved him. Each time he reviled them bitterly, and each time he carried away a bag of treasure. At last, one evening, as the sun sank and the children crossed the heath, they spied the dwarf again. He had emptied his jewels upon the ground, and the stones glittered like stars. Seeing the girls, he screamed in rage, but before he could curse them further, there came a low growl. Out of the forest bounded the black bear. The dwarf shrieked in terror, "Spare me, noble bear. Take my treasures, or better yet, eat these two plump maidens." But the bear paid him no heed, struck him dead with a single blow, and then turned kindly to the trembling sisters. Snow White, Rose Red, said he fear not. "It is I, your friend." And even as he spoke, the bearskin slipped away, and in his place stood a handsome prince, clothed all in gold. That wicked dwarf bewitched me, he said, and stole my treasure. Only at his death could the spell be broken. Soon after, Snow White became his bride, and Rose Red married his brother. The treasure was shared between them, and the old mother dwelt in peace at their side. Before her window stood the 2 rose trees, blossoming each year with flowers of white and red, as fair and faithful as the sisters themselves.